Member for his contribution. Are there any other statements? I call the member for Melbourne Ports.
Thank you very much, Acting Speaker. The cartoon character Mr Magoo is a retiree who manages to get himself in absurd situations due to his nearsightedness, compounded by a stubborn refusal to admit the problem. I'm reminded of the character's punchline, "Magoo, you've done it again," when reading the analysis of foreign correspondent Paul Magoo. Magoo is, of course, the biographer of Hamas boss Khaled Mashal and one of the few people in the world who regards him as a moderate. His similar so-called authoritative analysis, not, as young people put it these days, was his scoop that the then Iraqi leader Iyad Alawi personally shot prisoners in a Baghdad jail. The thing that ties those previous comments together with his analysis of what is happening, very similar to the Greens' analysis of this situation in Iraq, is anti-Americanism. You cannot judge situations in international events simply by an ideological framework, by looking at them without looking at them afresh, as the Leader of the Opposition has, as the member for Wakefield has, as members of the Opposition have in supporting the government. We don't do that because we just simply want to parrot the government. We've done it from an ethical point of view, as the member for Wakefield has explained. We've seen Magoo and the Greens push these near-sighted arguments that Australia should not be involved in Iraq because Iraq is more dangerous than ever. In Friday's article in Fairfax, Magoo described every possible danger that the Australian military will face in Iraq. However, he fails to balance his analysis with the threat that a permanent terrorist state in northern Iraq and Syria would pose not just to Iraqi minorities, but to countries around the world, including Australia. It's very regrettable to see our country in The Economist magazine ranking 4th as the punching above our weight, in this case, a category we wouldn't like to be in this occasion, of the 4th Western country with proportionately the highest number of people in ISIL. We have to admit that there is a problem. That is the first part to sort of having some correct analysis of this situation. Labor, along with the Australian government and a growing list of countries around the world, don't share the Greens' Magoo blindness. As the opposition leader explained on Monday, Labor believes that the terrorist state that has been proclaimed in Iraq represents a threat to Australian national security, unlike one we've ever faced. Now, of course, the situation does not demand that Australia would send any formed infantry formations like we did in the Iraq War. No one is talking about boots on the ground. We're talking about humanitarian assistance to besieged minorities. We're talking perhaps, this hasn't been asked for by the Iraqi government, but when a new Iraqi government is properly formed and they do make a request for this, Australia would perhaps consider some kind of air assistance to preventing these ISIS fanatics besieging other minorities and giving some assistance to Iraqi or Peshmerga Kurdish ground forces. Developments in Syria and Iraq are issues I've spoken about many times. Australians going to join terrorist groups in the Middle East have been an issue I've taken up since the second half of last year. The Attorney-General, in my view, has only focused on this too late. Scores of Australians fighting in Iraq and Syria pose a threat to us for the information of the Green political party, because they might return home radicalised with skills that would enable them to be involved in a mass casualty attack in Australia. These returned fighters are capable of such actions as has already been demonstrated. In May this year, and the world affects the rest of us, in May this year, Mehdi Namouche, a French citizen who was known to have fought with ISIS and who travelled through this part of the world before he returned to Belgium, murdered 4 people in the Jewish Museum in Brussels. He coldly took out a Kalashnikov and shot each of them in the head, being a battle-hardened veteran of ISIS. More recently, Australia and the wider world was horrified to see the video of a British terrorist brutally murdering the American journalist James Foley, while Australian Khalid Sharoof proudly tweeted a hideous photo of him and his son holding up severed heads. The doyen of Australian political commentators, Paul Kelly, argued that that photo of the little Australian boy being ripped from the suburbs of Australia by his jihadist father into the horrors of Syria and Iraq was an iconic moment in Australian political perceptions of this issue. Khalid himself has tweeted, "If I wanted to attack yous, I could easily have done so. I love to slaughter Australians. When you dogs are slaughtered, I'm happy." Even the self-proclaimed leader of this group, the Caliph, the man Baghdadi, the self-styled Caliph, I should say, despite the insouciance of Senator Milne, said when released from custody by United States authorities in Iraq in 2006, "We will meet again in New York." If Senator Milne doesn't understand what that means, I'll translate for her. These people want to bring their views, their activities, their terrorism to Australia, to Europe, to the United States. Australian members of ISIS will go to any lengths to commit murder. In July, an Australian ISIS member known as Abu Bakr al-Australi blew himself up outside a Shia mosque, killing 5 people and injuring 40. And there is another poor 19-year-old deranged young fellow from Brunswick in Melbourne who was the second suicide bomber of ISIL. These things affect us, Senator Milne and Senator Rhiannon. It's preventing young Australians being involved in this that certainly should form part of our motivation in seeing that ISIS is not successful. Al-Australi's Act is one example of the countless massacres, rapes and other acts of savagery that ISIS have effected on minorities in Iraq and Syria. In an emergency debate on Monday, the UN Deputy Commissioner for Human Rights, Flavia Pansieri, said her reports reveal acts of inhumanity on an unimaginable scale. The UN report was based on 480 interviews and documentary evidence, and it says children have been present at the executions, which take the form of beheadings or shootings in the head at close range. Bodies are placed in public display, often on crucifixes, for up to 3 days, serving as a warning to local residents. Various sources indicate that thousands of defenceless Yazidis, Christians, Kurds and Shia civilians have been massacred by ISIS in the last few months. And all of us, Speaker, all of this in the Parliament, I'm sure even the Green political party, were shocked to see just recently 250 near-naked Syrian soldiers marched off to be machine-gunned on YouTube by these brutes. And earlier we saw 1,500 members of the Iraqi army, the same thing happening to them, again broadcast on YouTube. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights in recent weeks, ISIS has sold 300 Yazidi girls and women into sexual slavery after they've been captured by its fighters in Syria. The Egyptian religious authority, Dar al-Ifta, has recently called on ISIS to be referred to as al-Qaeda Separatists in Iraq and Syria. The Dar al-Ifta hopes to help demonstrate to non-Muslims that this group's extremist ideology and depravity do not represent Islam. Dar al-Ifta's intervention is one of the many examples of moderate and, frankly, even not so moderate Islamic groups condemning ISIS's behaviour. For example, Indonesia's Ulama Council issued a fatwa against QSIS, as I call them. Even Saudi Arabia's Grand Mufti, Sheikh Abdulaziz al-Sheikh, has described QSIS as the enemy #1 of Islam, and the member for Wakefield pointed out that prominent British imams have issued a fatwa against them. I agree we should not be honouring these murderers and rapists with their illustrious name of choice. So from now on, I'm going to refer to them as al-Qaeda Separatists of Iraq and Syria. The Leader of the Opposition stated on Monday of QSIS that it is an enemy of humanity, engaged in crimes against humanity. QSIS's enemy is the very existence of peace, the presence of justice, the freedom of worship, freedom of association, freedom of speech and freedom itself. Iraq and Syria are far away, but we must not be nearsighted. Australians, like other people around the world of goodwill, may well see violence brought home to them, but only the blind would refuse to admit that these people in IS, the QSIS as I call them, are not a problem for the whole world. Mr Magoe and the Green political party may be happy to remain nearsighted and cite only the problems and be in denial of his namesake, Mr Magoo. But QSIS is anything but a joke. Faced with evil, it's impossible to relativise us. We must act, and I commend both the government and the opposition for identifying this as a separate and new problem and acting in a measured and balanced way without going to the extent that we did in the previous war in Iraq.
I thank the member for his contribution. Are there any